It's been a little bit over a year since I first came out to my friends and acquaintances and later on to the general public as genderqueer. I received nothing but love and support with literally no bad experiences attached. That's why I was extremely surprised when I went online and saw that there's kind of a sentiment against non-binary people, which doesn't seem to be the exception.
I feel like there are two genders.
Okay, yeah.
Non-binary, genderfuck, genderqueer, agender, gray gender, genderless. You are free to identify as anything you'd like. I'm not here to regulate thoughts. I'm simply here to regulate this false premise that it's valid in any other setting other than inside of your own head.
They call themselves non-binary, and they're like the frickin' masters of bamboozling.
I believe in two genders and the absence of gender. I do believe you can be male or female, and then there's a gray area where you just don't identify with either one. And I guess that's what you would call a non-binary. But all of these crazy genders that people have come up with are absolutely absurd to me.
Yes, I 100% believe that there are only two genders, there aren't three genders, there aren't 76 genders, and at the end of the day, it really isn't an identity, it's just a label.
People are coming up with different names for those different types of gender expressions, when in the old days we just called it being a tomboy.
Yeah.
Or just being a woman who liked to dress more masculine, whatever that even means.
Wow, that's a lot of hot takes that bring those creators their sweet, sweet Patreon dollars. It's amazing how simple it is to make hella lots of money online when you feed people their own sentiment. But do their claims hold any truth? Taking a look at their claims, there's one thing that becomes really obvious. It's always based around vague assumptions and wild anecdotes presented in a miserable way in order to save bigots, rational skeptics, and confirm to their biases in hopes of getting some cheap acceptance in return. Seems a little foolish, huh? But at the same time it makes perfect sense. Just take a look at the comment section. It's probably already filled with penis-vagina simplifications, halfback knowledge about chromosomes, and poorly recycled attack helicopter jokes. But unfortunately I'm already aware of my cultural Marxist SJW snowflakery, so it doesn't really resonate with me. But what are those wild theories that could make some Tumblr-gendered degenerate freak like me feel validated? Let's take a look. It all started on Judith Butler's infamous Tumblr blog called Gender Trouble in 1990, which was so well received it was actually republished as a real book in the same year. Butler coined the idea that gender is performative. However, gender performance is not performative in a way that it's something you just play, but rather that it has a productive outcome. According to Butler, identity is not the cause, but rather the product of your own gender performance, and there's not really a way to do this wrong. In conclusion, this leads to the following things. Gender identity is not artificial and arbitrary, but not completely determined either, cause it depends a lot on the individual and their social context. We can't overcome gender as a whole, but it's inherently open for transformation and can therefore, in reality, be made different and less enforcing as we constantly produce gender through our own performance. Butler herself was even hopeful that gender traders and outlaws like me would coin new identities to escape restrictive norms. Therefore, only oneself can state their own gender identity, cause it stems from one's own experience and perception of oneself. That's a rather simplified overview of Butler's theory, but it breaks it down to the core. Gender is formed and reassured at every given moment based on your personal perception and actions and your connection to the outside world. There is no one-size-fits-all explanation, because no two people experience life and therefore gender the same. And in all honesty, if you oppose the evil SJW doctrine of identity politics in favor for the rational free-thinking utopia called individualism, you should really be down to go to that party. Because at the end of the day, that's what it's all about, finding yourself and achieving fulfillment and autonomy over yourself on your own terms. In all fairness, not all the people we're gonna talk about deny the existence of non-binary people right away, and misrepresenting their points wouldn't help to get the conversation any further. But because they are always so vague about what they actually believe in, it's hard to figure out what their points really are. So let's work through them chapter by chapter. Chapter 1. All those freaking gender terms. So much for Butler theory, but she wasn't the one coming up with all those silly gender terms like man or women, and in all honesty, she really didn't even have a reason to. So what's the matter about the semantics? Butler defining gender terms would have been counterproductive, because language is supposed to be descriptive rather than prescriptive. It's a tool for communicating what we feel and what is happening around us that gets formed and expanded while we use it. In fact, languages can change a lot over time. While Japanese has changed relatively little over 1,000 years, other languages like English or German have evolved pretty rapidly. That's why some older literature like Shakespeare can be pretty difficult to understand for modern day speakers. But that still doesn't explain all those silly gender terms, does it? Right? Why do we need so many of them? In all honesty, we probably don't, and I've only seen a few terms used in everyday situations. Those being genderqueer and non-binary, which are umbrella terms to let others know that you are somewhere in the gender spectrum, and agender, which simply describes the absence of gender, and maybe gender fluid, which describes that your perception of gender shifts a little bit over time on some occasions, and of course attack helicopter, which means your gender is a 5-year-old dead meme. In terms of legal recordings, the process is even more simple. Most countries that acknowledge non-binary genders at this point have simply added a third box that's labeled as diverse, dead inside, or others that serve for non-binary and intersex folks alike. And even though this topic is still debated in trans circles, people seem to be fine with the third box approach in general. Shouldn't be too much to ask, huh? That's more than enough to express yourself, let others know what they are dealing with, and that you don't actually have American ancestry and that your parents didn't even come up with your name, god damn it! Also, most of them learned the names and types of approximately 500 Pokemons, so 3 new gender terms shouldn't push them to the point of desperation. But what's giving people more headache, I assume, are more specific terms like demigender, maverick, grey gender, bigender, pangender, paragender, gender flux, and so on. And those are mostly terms in use within the community itself on several occasions, mostly to describe yourself a little bit further in conversations with other trans and non-binary folks, and spread a little further because internet conversations are pretty public most of the time. In my experience, more specific terms also get used more by younger non-binary people who still struggle to find themselves out, and the internet provides a relatively safe place for them to get in touch with other non-binary folks. And to be completely honest with you, I can't keep track of all those terms either. Sometimes I even think to myself that a term might be a joke or is way too specific, but I don't feel the need to start shit about it. If it helps someone to find themselves out and feel comfortable in their own skin, that's good on them, and why should I stop them? If you want to take part in these discussions, it might be helpful to learn some of the more commonly used terms, but you really don't have to learn them all. Most genderqueer people are open for explanations, so don't be afraid to ask. Chapter 2. What makes someone a true trans?
You need gender dysphoria to be trans. You see the links that I'm trying to link up here. You see where I'm getting at. You see where I'm getting at.
Nowadays, obviously, I'm a very big advocate for the fact that you do have to have gender dysphoria in order to be transgender.
Transgenderism is a mental disorder. That's a statement that I've made in a number of interviews and podcasts.
So right off the bat, I do think that you need dysphoria to be trans.
So my question here is, how can somebody be trans at FTM, MTF, without experiencing gender dysphoria? Because that is the reason why I transitioned. And I see posts all the time that say, oh, you don't need dysphoria to be trans. Why do you have to make it all so negative? Because it was.
How would you know that you're transgender unless you experience dysphoria?
There's one positive thing I really have to acknowledge. All of them don't actually hold the exact same belief that they just repeat after one another, but slightly different versions of the same shitty opinion. Some believe that you can tell if someone is serious about being trans by how they look. Others acknowledge that passing and transitioning can be hard for some. Some restrict being trans to body dysphoria, others acknowledge social dysphoria as well. Some deny the existence of non-binary people right away, others accept them as long as they have dysphoria. Some believe that the experiences of non-binary folks are so vastly different from their own that they can't really judge them, which would be an honorable approach if they would give other binary trans folks the same benefit of a doubt. They want you to take their beliefs at face value, and I would actually believe them that they do it themselves as well. They believe that because they feel like it's the truth. There's literally no other explanation when even the fucking World Health Organization disagrees with you. The WHO maintains the International Statistical Classification of Diseases and Related Health Problems, short ICD, which around 90% of health professionals worldwide depend on. Gender identity disorder will be removed from the list of mental health conditions in the 11th revision and will instead be replaced with gender incongruence. This new entry will be added for a new section called Conditions Related to Sexual Health, just next to such horrible things as pregnancy and childbirth. This is nothing completely new, but has been discussed for years. Resulting from new evidences, the WHO led to the following changes. The WHO will no longer medicalize being trans. Research has found that distress and dysfunction in trans individuals stems mostly from experiences of social rejection and violence, rather than trans identity itself. Therefore, it no longer holds up to the definition of a mental illness, which is that distress and dysfunction are essential parts of the condition. This was, for example, backed from a 2016 study called Removing Transgender Identity from the Classification of Mental Disorders, a Mexican field study for ICD-11, which is linked in the description below. The WHO acknowledges that medical assistance can be essential for some trans individuals. That's why a new entry called Gender Incongruence was implemented, which is defined as a marked and persistent incongruence between an individual's experienced gender and the assigned sex. This is meant to make sure that individuals who need it still receive treatment and insurance companies will still pay for it. All hail to the scientific method, baby, cause that's exactly how it works. Verification and being able to change in response to new evidence is a key part of that. Sorry, but facts over fields, hunty. I'm certainly not gonna tell you what to do though. If it makes you feel better, go ahead and scream out how being trans is a mental illness. Maybe be a little more consistent in your argument and claim that giving childbirth is a mental illness as well. I promise I will support your Patreon campaign for the good laughs you will provide me. But I'm fairly certain that only a few people really want to stay stubborn about this. I'm pretty sure that the vast majority of people wants to make sense of it and just has a hard time doing so. So let's take a look. What is being trans all about? In order to break the trans experience down into simple terms, I'd argue the best way to make sense of it is to think of it in different categories. The first one I'd call gender euphoria, which can refer to the euphoric and self-fulfilling state of mind that you achieve through being referred to with the right names and pronouns, playing around with your appearance in a way that reflects your gender performance, even by owning your okayness with yourself in some cases, and maybe even celebrating your queerness in whatever way or just by having your gender figured out. And of course by the way you're treated by others. The second category is of course gender dysphoria, which refers to the unease and dissatisfaction as well as emotional and physical distress you feel regarding the way you're looked at and treated by others in cases of social dysphoria, or your current body not falling in line with your gender identity in the case of body dysphoria. Of course the impact of your gender performance is something that follows you around all the time, and there are certainly variations in intensity, so every definition is already flawed in that regard, but probably the easiest way to get a simple understanding. Oftentimes the implication of gender euphoria isn't a point of debate, but the consequences that stem from them. Some people believe that a lack of gender euphoria will always result in gender dysphoria, of which the individual in question is just not aware yet. That seems like a comprehensive statement to make, but I think it lacks some nuance. The most intrinsic argument oftentimes is that when you change your name and pronouns in favor of gender euphoria, that must inherently mean you are dysphoric about your old ones. But that doesn't have to be the case. They can also just come off as unfitting, or as if they are referring to anyone but you, just leaving you completely unengaged. But there's more to it. What, for example, about people who got a relatively androgynous body by nature? They might be able to change how they are perceived by others solely based on their gender expression, which leaves relatively little room for social dysphoria to flourish. And they might not feel like their body is not coherent with their gender performance overall. And then there's always the this half-baked brain skin argument that's brought up more and more recently, even though most experts don't see it as accurate. Most of them stem from studies like those two you can see on screen right now, who came to the conclusion that white matter patterns in transmasculine people come closer to the theme patterns found in cisgender boys, and white matter patterns found in transfeminine people fall halfway between the patterns of cisgender boys and girls. Both studies included just 18 trans people each, by the way. First of all, those studies only make sense based on an assumed binary within the most complex organism ever found in human beings, and even then there's still more similarities than differences. Brains can't be easily distinguished in male and female, it's just that some characteristics are more common in one gender than the other. Unless one of those characteristics falls into an extreme, it's basically impossible to tell what's supposed to be a male brain and what's a female brain. And even then, you can always make an assumption but never tell for sure. A 2015 study titled Sex Beyond the Genitalia, the Human Brain Mosaic, compared similar studies regarding brain sex differences, including an HDD health study with 2,239 male and 2,621 female participants, from which only 0.1% showed internal consistency, but 70% showed substantial variability. That's just the one with the greatest sample size. In other cases, the results varied a lot, but overall the study came to the following conclusion. The lack of internal consistency in human brain and gender characteristics undermines the dimorphic view of human brain and behavior, and calls for a shift in our conceptualization of the relations between sex and the brain. Specifically, we should shift from thinking of brains as falling into two classes, one typical of males and the other typical of females, to appreciating the variability of the human brain mosaic. Studies like this can expand our knowledge of the brain and gender identity, but really not much more than this. If it was used to determine who's trans enough, that would only result in more gatekeeping within the medical sector and prevent people from getting help. The best way to tell someone's gender is asking them. Another factor that should be considered is your overall personality type. I'm fairly certain they have nailed a point there, and most trans people want to pass as good as they can and perfectly blend in with society. But there's still a fairly amount of trans people who don't see a problem with being visibly trans and embrace it as a radical action and form of protest, some of whom transition and some who don't. Silly me, of course they are just transgenders, who don't deserve the honorable medal for being trans because they don't feel miserable enough, I guess. Notice but though. I know dysphoria is shit and can make you feel miserable and like you're losing your mind at some point. I really hope for all people, even those I don't like, that they get the best fucking treatment their environment has to offer. But guess what? It's not transgenders who make your life miserable, but neoliberal politics designed to police your body and self-determination. You are so blinded by the real problem that you attack your allies. In fact, I live in a country where I'm unable to physically transition and it freaks the shit out of me. Will the WHO's updated definition change that in the future? Well, I surely hope so, otherwise I consider leaving this country behind. Until then, I'm at least glad that gender euphoria can provide me the slightest bit of peace of mind.
A lot of people make the claim that non-binary dysphoria is a thing. There's no such thing as non-binary dysphoria. Dysphoria is actually completely binary, because with gender dysphoria, it goes from male to female or female to male. It really doesn't go from half and half to like half to none.
But you can only transition from male to female or female to male. There's no in between because there's only two genders to match the two existing sexes.
You guys don't transition. You guys are not diagnosed with gender dysphoria, which is the mental illness that trans people have. You guys are to trans people as Rachel Dolezal was to black women.
Okay, fine, let's talk about non-binary transitioning then. Chapter 3. Non-binary transitioning. So basically the argument is non-binary people don't transition because they can't imagine how that would be possible. That's it. It's almost like it's not a fact, but feel truth. You know, they feel it is true, so it must be true. P.S. Facts don't care about your feelings, you're non-binary special snowflake SJW. I am well aware that's a more controversial stance even within trans medicalist circles, but it's really telling about how the minds of these people work. If they can't make sense of something right away with the full power of their solely free-thinking rational minds, it certainly can't exist. Having to think about something for more than 5 seconds is apparently cultural Marxism. I could easily point you to a non-binary person who transitioned to show you that they indeed exist. But instead, let's do something that SJW degenerate snowflakes like me supposedly hate. Looking at studies. Let's take a recent one from the Journal of Sexual Medicine, for example, which was released in the beginning of 2018. The study titled Gender and Individual Treatment Progress in Non-Binary Trans Individuals asked binary as well as non-binary trans people if they received or planned to seek treatment in form of mental health consulting, hormonal treatment, treatment concerning primary sex characteristics, or additional treatment not concerning primary sex characteristics. Overall, the only area in which non-binary people showed a huge lack of interest was treatment concerning primary sex characteristics, and the average non-binary person needs fewer treatments to reach their goal. Overall, the study came to the following result. Non-binary genderqueer participants reported significantly fewer received treatments compared with binary participants. For planned treatments, binary participants reported more treatments related to primary sex characteristics only. Binary participants required more treatments for a completed treatment than non-binary genderqueer participants. 6 versus 4. There were no differences with regard to individual treatment progress score. However, the study came to the conclusion that differences occur much more on an individual level rather than a collective one. While one person might just seek hormonal treatment and hair removal, another person might seek breast augmentation and GRS in addition, depending on their personal transition goal. That's pretty much my own non-binary experience as well. I fucking hate most of my body hair, except facial hair. I'm okay with that for the moment being. And I have an urgent desire for a less masculine body shape, and I'm almost certain it will only get worse with age if I don't do anything. But apart from that, I'm relatively fine, so I guess it's hair removal and maybe hormonal treatment that will do the magic for me. But I still live in Germany, a country where being trans is so heavily medicalized, every trans person is expected to go the same way and have the same goals. You even have to act like a cliché if you want to seek treatment, and non-binary identities are pretty much invisible in the medical sector. And I don't really see this getting better if we keep a narrow view on what being trans is all about. Whether dysphoria is involved or not, and shouldn't it be in the best interest for all of us if everyone gets what they need to create the best versions of themselves? But I guess challenging restrictive gender norms is cultural Marxist snowflakerist transgenderism. Or does your problem maybe root from somewhere else? Chapter 4. Transgenderism and the Optics.
Trenders are absolutely a thing. They give trans people such a bad name, such a bad look. They are the pretty much reason why a lot of people won't believe that trans people are actually like real and what they're going through is real.
I think a lot of times non-binary people are just people who are female, who present very masculine, or people who are male who present very feminine, and they just see the need to come up with a new gender just to be trendy, which is absolutely absurd to me. It really puts a bad name on real trans people like myself and a lot of my friends who are undergoing treatment.
You have trans activists saying that you don't need dysphoria to be trans. You're fucking hindering the trans community instead of helping it.
So that's your true problem. You seek cheap validation from people who see you as a useful idiot for punching down on other trans people, but secretly still see you as degenerate scum like they always did. And from a dysphoric standpoint, I kinda get it. You wanna fit in with society and be recognized for who you are, but at the same time you live a self-fulfilling prophecy. By enforcing a rigid view on gender, the pure act of fitting in becomes more and more rigid in itself until nobody can hold up to those standards anymore. I can't deny that there's an increase in hate and bigotry directed at trans folks over the last couple of years, but that's also because trans people have never been as visible before. Just take a look at the media. That's usually a sign that things are about to change. Visibility and representation have been accounted for an increase in acceptance long before. and all the hate and bigotry that comes with it is just the last reactionary reflex before things are about to change. And soon liberals and centrists will become more and more welcoming. The transgender movement never started with fighting for more medicalization, but the complete opposite. Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson, who kicked this whole movement off decades before the term transgender was even coined, both never medically transitioned. Both of them fought against medicalizing trans identities in time when they meant conversion therapy or even more horrible things. They both fought against rigid gender norms and for freedom and self-determination for all gender variant and trans people. Until today, the Sylvia Rivera Law Project, which was named in her honor, was dedicated to guarantee that all people are free to self-determine gender identity and expression regardless of income or race and without facing harassment, discrimination or violence. It's certainly a huge achievement that we have much more possibilities than we had before and that people can medically transition if they want to. I certainly do, while others may don't. Being trans or non-binary is not a choice, whether dysphoria is involved or not. But we can always choose what kind of world we want to see in the future. Do you want rigid norms that hurt everyone, or a free and just world for all? It's up to you, but I'm pretty positive about what the future will look like. Thanks for watching this video, and a special thank you to all my Patreons who came over from my old channel. Without them, I wouldn't have been able to kick this channel off in the first place. If you want to help me create more videos like this in the future, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter as well.